didn't happen until 3:51, actually 3:54, and he's got plenty of time to stage the crime scene. He's got plenty to do. He's got to stage it outside and inside. Outside, he has to plant the journal. He's got to retrieve the gasoline from the gas cans in the garage, and he has to leave the truck keys for himself in the Ranger. Inside, he's got to place the gun. He has to find Vashti's cell phone so that he can make that call that he plants to make it look like she called him. He's got to pour the gasoline everywhere. He's got to get rid of some of his clothing, his shirt, his shoes, his socks. We don't have any of that. He's got to go and get his cell phone because he's going to make a 911 call. He's got to light the fire. He's got to get the boys out of there in time, and then he has to call 911. So that's what he's doing during this time. And that's the significance of what Cammie heard. So the next thing we have on the timeline is that planted cell phone call from Vashti's phone to the defendant's phone. And there's no dispute that that happens at 3:51 a.m. and it's 4 minutes long. The next thing that happens is the 911 call at 3:54 a.m. The defendant calls in to dispatch, and that's in evidence. You heard that recording, and you can listen to it again. At the same time, Sergeant Sowers is dispatched to 255 East B in Kingman. You saw his in-car video. And after the defendant talks to 911, what does he do next? Well, he makes some other phone calls right away. He makes 2 different phone calls right in the same time period, around 4 a.m., to his dad, Lot Seacat. Then he makes a couple of phone calls to Connie Suderman's office. Connie Suderman is the marriage counselor. This is what he's doing just minutes after his wife's death. You have a video footage, several tracks of video actually in evidence from Sean Harbord. And he's the guy who was in the neighborhood, had his cell phone, and videotaped the fire. And you can see the concentration of the fire on the south part of that house in the video. We know at 4:40 a.m., Chief Holloway is interviewing the defendant at the law enforcement center, and the defendant makes several statements that we will talk about. 5 in the morning, the fire department makes access to the house. 9:30 that morning, the defendant gets Connie Suderman on the phone, and he says to her, "I killed her, Vashti is dead, and it's my fault." That's 9:30 a.m. on April 30th of 2011. And just a reminder that the night of April 30th, that Saturday, was the night that Vashti had plans to go out with Jill Aaron and her friends. Well, let's talk about Vashti's plans. Let's talk about her outlook on life in April of 2011 and what she was thinking about for the future. We know that they'd been in counseling since October of 2010. We know that she'd made the decision. She was going to divorce him. She was going to move on. But she wasn't just planning the divorce. She'd made some other lifestyle changes. She was healthy, working out, eating right, going back to church, reconnecting with her friends, planning trips, buying new clothes, doing well at work. She had just passed an exam that she needed for her HR position. And all of the witnesses that testified in front of you, Jill Aaron, Jamie Arnold, Sari Tabad, Joy Trotnick, Melissa Beasley, Scott Hankins, Tracy Freeman, Connie Suderman, not one of those witnesses told you that Vashti Seacat was sad or depressed. She wasn't depressed. She was moving on. They said she was happy. She had a positive outlook. She was hopeful about her future. She was excited about the direction that her life was taking. The only people that have tried to tell you that Vashti was depressed in April of 2011 are the defendant and his brother, Bobby Seacat. And we need to talk about Bobby Seacat's testimony. Now, Bobby Seacat is a former law enforcement officer, and he's the older brother of the defendant. And he had to come in here and tell you that Vashti was depressed on Easter weekend before she died. He had to do it because he can't believe himself what his brother would be capable of doing. He said that now he remembers that she looked sleepy and tired, and he thinks she looked depressed. But remember, on cross-examination, he was asked whether he remembered telling law enforcement that Vashti and Brett seemed happy on Easter weekend. Remember that he was asked if he remembered saying that he didn't see any signs of depression. He says he doesn't recall making that statement. Now, Bobby Seacat's a former law enforcement officer. He has training just like the defendant has training, just like all the other officers who testified in front of you have training. And he knows the value of giving a complete statement. He knows that he needs to include all of that information when he talks to law enforcement. And if he would have believed that Vashti Seacat looked depressed Easter weekend before she died, he would have told law enforcement that. He would have made that statement. So we know that Vashti was making plans. We know about the treadmill. She was going to deliver that and sell that the next day. We know that she had plans to go out dancing with her friends on Saturday night, and that's a fact that's important for more than one reason. First, it shows you how happy she was. It shows you that she was excited and she was having fun. But the other thing that's significant about that fact is it shows you why Brett Seacat had to murder Vashti on Friday, April 29th. He had to do it that night. The testimony from Jamie Arnold is that Vashti told her she had given him only until Sunday at noon to get out of the house. She only agreed to that to keep the peace. So if Vashti's going out on Saturday night with her friends in Wichita, which was the testimony, she's probably going to stay over in Wichita that night. We know that because the defendant, in his recorded interview with Agent Folletti, he told Folletti that when she went out in Wichita, she usually stayed over with a friend, and he preferred that. He encouraged that. So that's what she's going to do on Saturday night after she goes out. She won't be home. It's the only night that he's going to be in the house with Vashti. And he knows this. This is his only opportunity. This is the time for him to commit the murder. Again, going back to other plans that Vashti is making. We know that she's planning trips with her sister. We know that she's going to a concert. We have the concert tickets in evidence. The concert's going to be May 19th. There are 2 tickets, $65 a piece. She bought those. She made hotel reservations. She made those hotel reservations just 11 days before she died. Does that sound like the mentality of somebody who's depressed and about to commit suicide? She's buying concert tickets, planning trips, making hotel reservations. You have physical exhibits that show you what she was planning. And the divorce was part of the plan too. She was headed in a new direction. She'd made a decision that she was at peace with, and she'd made that decision and she stuck by it despite the defendant's threats. Despite the threats that he kept making to take the kids, to kill her. And the defendant wants you to believe that he made this threat on Friday night. That he made a threat, you're having an affair with your boss and with a VP, with a vice president at Cox Communications. And I'm going to expose that threat. And I'm going to get you fired and ruin your career. That's what he says he told her on Friday night. And he wants you to believe that he made that threat and that pushed Vashti to the point of, now I have no other option. I mean, I'm happy, I've lost weight, I'm doing great, I'm feeling great, I've reconnected with friends, my kids are my whole life, I love them to death, but suicide is my only option now because Brett's going to get me fired. So I have to do it. That's what he's asking you to buy. That's the reason that he's testifying about the threat. Other planning for the divorce, well, we know about the money order. And skipping back, these are the text messages about the treadmill from Jamie Arnold. Those are in evidence as photos. The money order. The day before Vashti died, at lunch, she's buying a $50 money order. Here's a close-up. It's in evidence in that photo. It was in her purse. And money orders are like cash. So the day before she dies, she's spending $50 cash on parenting classes that are supposed to happen the next week. And this is another fact that's significant for more than one reason. Not only does it show you that she's looking ahead to the next week and planning for her future, but it also, again, tells you about the defendant's timing and about his testimony. He doesn't know about the money order. It's in her purse. He wouldn't know that until he's arrested and he sees the evidence that the state has against him. And that's the point. After he's arrested in 2 years before he comes to trial, that's the point that he has this threat, this story about this threat on Friday night. Okay, why tell you that he made this threat on Friday night before she died? Because the timing is crucial. He knows you're going to see all this evidence, including something like she's buying a money order Friday at noon, and go, that doesn't look like somebody who's going to kill themselves. But he tells you he threatened her that Friday night, that's what he pushed her to the point of suicide, that's the reason for the timing. That's how he wants you to discount all the evidence of everything she's feeling, thinking, and doing. Because Friday night, I made this threat to her, and that left her with no other option than suicide. That's the message that he's controlling, packaging, and sending it to you. The defendant's threats all show how controlling and how manipulative that he is. A leopard doesn't change his spots. He makes threats continuously in the time period leading up to the divorce. Threatens to take the kids away. He tells Chief Holloway that I bullied her by using those kids as a threat. He threatens that if she ever leaves, if she ever has an affair, that he'll kill her. He specifically threatens her that if you divorce me, I will kill you, I will burn the house down, and I will make it look like you did it. These are threats that the defendant made, and you heard in evidence from witnesses. These are threats that are going on leading up to Vashti's death. And none of those threats deterred her from divorce. So he had to make good on them. He didn't have a choice left. He had to kill her. And that evidence came from witnesses like Connie Suderman, Jill Aaron, Joy Trotnick, Melissa Beasley, and Scott Hankins told you the one about I'm going to kill you, burn the house down, and make it look like a suicide. Those are the witnesses that presented those threats. And then you'll remember the testimony about a dream. He wakes her up in the middle of the night and tells her that he had a dream that he tried to kill her. And that's an indirect threat. It's just more fear, more control, more manipulation on his part. Now, when he talks to law enforcement, you saw the interview, and he brings up using the kids as a threat. Well, why does he do that? You're probably asking yourselves, why would he admit that he made that threat? Because he made that threat in front of Connie Suderman. She told you that he said, if Vashti divorces me, I'm going to take the kids and run. So that threat's already out there. It's already made to a third party, and he's law enforcement. He knows how this process works. He knows that witnesses are going to be interviewed. He knows that Connie Suderman is going to be interviewed, and she's going to tell them about this threat. So he has to bring that up when he's talking to them. What he doesn't know is that anybody knows about the threat, I'm going to kill you, burn the house down, and make it look like a suicide. He doesn't know that anybody's aware of that. That's one of the things he couldn't control about Vashti. Because when she went to counseling and she started standing up for herself, she started making friends and confiding in her friends, she told them things like this, and he couldn't control that. And that's why he's shocked and he's angered when he's confronted with that evidence in the recorded interview. Watch that portion of the recorded interview. That's CD3 at 1 hour and 11 minutes in. That's the point in the interview he starts to get angry. He's getting confronted with the evidence, and he didn't know that anybody knew about that threat. Once he knows that, then we've got to change the message. Then we've got to ramp it up, because that's not going to sell here in front of you. So then we have a statement about a different threat. Right? That's inconsistent from what he told Agent Folletti in the interview. He was specifically asked about whether or not threats were made, and he denied it. And he told you on the stand today, told you on the stand on Friday actually, that he made a threat to expose an affair that Vashti was having with her boss and to ruin her career. That's inconsistent, and he's changing the message because he has to explain his actions. And the only thing that supports this supposed threat on Friday night comes from the defendant himself, comes from his own statement. And he's the man who has a reason to control and manipulate what you hear. The day before Vashti dies, he's planning, he's premeditating at KLETC. You know he's asking for an overhead projector, and he told you that he was using that because he was practicing forgery. He was making a Social Security card. That's what he's doing the day before Vashti dies. And he's torching hard drives, and he's destroying cell phones. Now he did this, the hard drives, he did those out in the open. He asked for a torch. And then when he took the witness stand, he admitted that the cell phones were his too. Well, if that information has no connection to the murder of Vashti, then let me ask you a couple of questions having to do with where those cell phones that are in evidence, the torched hard drives that are in evidence, where did those end up? They didn't end up in the trash can in his office. He left the shop and he took one torched hard drive and he threw it away outside. And he kept the other one and he threw that away in the same trash can with the two cell phones. So why doesn't he just throw the torched hard drives away in the shop to begin with? And why doesn't he just throw the cell phones away in his office? He's manipulating where he puts things. He's not putting them, he's distancing them from himself. He's distancing them from the shop. It's suspicious behavior the day before Vashti dies. And this map shows you the dot at the top, the yellow dot, is where one torched hard drive is trashed. Dot at the bottom is the other trash can that has the cell phones and the other hard drive. And the yellow square is Brett Seacat's office. If there's nothing to be concerned about, no worries, then why distance yourself? Why take such pains to throw these away in separate trash bins at separate times? And those photos show you, photo on the left shows the hard drive with the cell phone and then the torched hard drive at the top. That's where they were found. And those photos are in evidence for you. Now let's talk about the fire at 255 East B. There's a couple of things that you need to consider about the fire, starting with the points of origin. Now there's more than one fire involved in this case. There's one that originated in the southwest storage area of the home. There's one that originated outside the master bedroom in the hallway. And these fires are lit separately. And that's Agent Monty's testimony. And you'll remember that when he was pressed on cross-examination, he was asked about the fire in the master bedroom. And he said that he thinks the fire there was lit separately too. So that's 3 fires that we've got going on in this case. And he testified that the fire moved south to north down the hallway. He said that the heat and the fire attacked the master bedroom from the hallway side. So the fire that burned the hottest and burned the longest was the one in the southwest storage area. And we know that he knows that from the fire burn patterns and the amount of damage that was done to the area. So what that tells you is that the fire was set here first. The defendant set the fire in that area first because he couldn't box himself in. He had to get out. He had to have time to get himself out, and he had to have time to save the boys. Now, the defendant told Agent Folletti in his recorded interview that the bedroom was on fire. Remember the statements about walking through fire and reaching through fire? Well, the evidence shows that when Sergeant Sowers got there, that master bedroom wasn't on fire yet. And when Sowers gets there, the defendant is already out. So how could the defendant have walked through the bedroom that was on fire if it's not yet on fire? These are Sowers' photos. This shows you the southwest storage area. This is the southeast part of the home. Master bedroom window. You can see it in this photo. There's no flames in there. The bedroom's not on fire. This is after the defendant's out of the house. Again, southeast corner, top right part of the screen. Master bedroom window. No fire. Master bedroom isn't on fire yet. What happened is the defendant lit the fire in the master bedroom, but it didn't take off right away. And that's what those photos show you. And those photos show you that he couldn't have walked through fire and reached through fire, like he said, because the fire's not going yet when Sowers gets there. Well, how else do we know that he didn't walk or reach through fire? Remember all the discussion about burns and all those photos that law enforcement took of the defendant? When he took the stand, he wanted to play word games on cross-examination with me about walking in fire versus walking through fire. He told Agent Folletti in the interview that he reached for Vashti using his left arm. This photo shows his left hand, no burns. Left arm, no burns. Left shoulder and upper chest, no burns. Not even any redness or singed hairs. And in his recorded interview, he says that there is fire between he and Vashti when he went to the bed, fire everywhere in that room. And ladies and gentlemen, this is CD3 at 17 minutes and 35 seconds in. If his story is accurate, he should have at least some singed hair and some redness on his skin. He should have burns, and there's nothing there. So the burns that he does have is basically a minor blister on his left foot. These are all photos of his left foot. Now we're going to switch to his right foot. That doesn't show any burns. So what's the explanation for the disproportion of burns between his feet? Right? If he's rushing into the fire, if he's rushing and walking into the fire, his feet should be equally exposed. He shouldn't have burns on one and not the other. Unless he's sticking one leg in, that doesn't make any sense. What the evidence shows you is that he didn't walk in fire. He stood, and when he lit the fire, he stood like this. He had his left foot in front. That's what makes sense from the evidence. He needed to get away quickly. It's a gas fire. It's going to flash up at him pretty quickly. That would explain for the disproportion of burns on the left foot as opposed to the right foot. Because apparently the left foot is somewhere that the right foot wasn't. Let's talk about the gun. The Ruger Red Hawk 44 Magnum. You've seen that gun in evidence. Heard testimony about it from Sari Taban, one of Vashti's friends who went to the range with them and who's actually shot the gun. And then you had Zach Carr, the firearm analyst. So when you go back to the jury room, I want you to pick up this gun. I want you to pick up this heavy handgun. I want you to notice the weight. I want you to notice the length of the barrel. And I want you to pull the trigger. You remember from Zach Carr's testimony that the firearm was damaged in the fire. So, in order to pull the trigger, you're going to have to push forward this cylinder release latch right here on the left side of the gun, and you can pull that trigger. Hold it with 2 hands. Hold it with 1 hand. Feel the weight of that gun. Then think about Sari Taban's testimony about firing that gun. She shot it. It was heavy. It's hard to position. Took her 2 hands to shoot it. It was uncomfortable. Kicked back. She said that Vashti also shot the gun that day, and her reaction to it was exactly the same as hers. Vashti had to use 2 hands to shoot it. She was uncomfortable with it. She said that Vashti didn't like guns. She wasn't into guns. Think about that, and then remember Zach Carr's testimony about actual and perceived recoil. All the things that factor into actual and perceived recoil: size, grip, strength, experience, angle, load. Those are the things that will affect how that gun is fired and the recoil of that gun. And then ask yourselves whether you believe the defendant's story that this is the gun that Vashti Seacat chose to shoot herself in the head, this heavy handgun, when there was actually a .25 caliber Raven on the dresser in the master bedroom too. But she chose the big gun, the dirty hairy gun, as the defendant refers to it in the interview. Not only did she choose that gun, but she managed to get it up to her head and to angle it just right so it went at a downward angle and sliced her spinal cord. That's what you have to believe that Vashti did this to herself. Then you also have to believe that the actual recoil of the gun somehow left it underneath her body. And the location of the gun is the next thing we're going to talk about. That gun ended up underneath the left side of her body, right under her breast, completely underneath her. Ask yourselves how the recoil of that gun didn't send it across the room, or at the very least on the other side of the bed, because we know Vashti's right-handed. How did the gun end up underneath her body? And beyond that, how did Vashti end up on her left side? We know the defendant tells us she was on her back when he entered the room. How did her dead body, because death, as Dr. Oberst told you, was nearly instantaneous, roll itself over onto her side with her arms tucked, her knees flexed, and perfectly on top of the firearm? Common sense, ladies and gentlemen. How does that happen? How does the gun end up there? And we're going to talk about the trajectory or the path of the bullet. These are photos from Dr. Oberst's testimony. That's the angle that bullet passed through Vashti Seacat. Right to left, downward, slightly front to back. That is the angle that occurs when someone picks up that gun, walks up to Vashti Seacat, who's laying on her left side, stands over top of her, and pulls the trigger. That's what that angle is consistent with. Look at the rod. That angle is consistent with someone who is laying in bed asleep. When the defendant gets the gun, walks up to her sleeping body, laying on her left side, puts the gun to her head, and pulls the trigger. That's what those photos show you. That's the path of the bullet. That's what's consistent with the evidence. Now let's talk about the autopsy. Now we know that we've got gas fires involved here, and you were told that gas fires burn dirty, and they have a smoke layer that develops quickly. So use your common sense. Whoever is walking around setting those fires is going to breathe in some smoke. Use your knowledge of gas fires. Use what the expert told you. And remember that Dr. Oberst said that there's no soot in Vashti Seacat's lungs, there's no soot in her airways, there's no carbon monoxide in her blood. And Agent Monty told you that when you breathe in smoke, you breathe in carbon monoxide. Vashti Seacat never breathed in any smoke. And what does that tell you? She was dead already when those fires were lit. Or else she'd have smoke or soot. She'd have soot in her lungs. And she didn't. Another interesting finding from the autopsy, 380 milliliters of urine in Vashti's bladder. The reason why Dr. Oberst thought that this was significant is because that amount of urine would have, in her words, caused a strong urge to urinate. And that's what she called it. I'm going to call it doing the dance. Have you ever had that feeling? The defendant wants you to believe that Vashti Seacat was so dead set on killing herself that she couldn't stop to urinate before she walked around the house setting 3 separate fires and holding her breath the entire time. That's the significance of that finding in the autopsy. We also have the BDUs. These are the pants that the defendant had on when he came to the Law Enforcement Center. There's been a lot of discussion about these BDUs. And Chris Riddle, the state's expert, told you that he tested them and they had gasoline on them. Well, again, we know gas fires are involved in this case. So gasoline on the defendant's pants is a direct link between the defendant and the crime scene. It's a direct link between him pouring gasoline at the crime scene and spilling a little bit on his pants, probably without him ever knowing it, and then lighting the fires. Now, you can open up that bag when you get back there, and you won't smell any gasoline on the pants. And I submit to you that when the defendant spilled that gasoline on his pants, he didn't smell it either. Because if he had, we wouldn't have those here in evidence. He would have gotten rid of those, like his other clothes. He knows he's going to be interviewed. He knows he's going to have everything from him collected. So he doesn't smell it either. And the smell test is not the only thing that detects gasoline. If it was, we wouldn't need Chris Riddle and the science of arson testing. You and I could just use our noses and leave it at that. Well, we didn't leave it at that. Chris Riddle tested the pants and he found that there was gasoline on them. And he told you that when he got the bag, he was a little concerned because it didn't look like a bag he recognized, but his concern was whether the vapors may have already escaped. Well, they hadn't. The gas was still on the pants. Just another piece of physical evidence connecting the defendant to this murder. Now, the defendant set the house on fire because he didn't want any evidence of his crimes. And he banked on that fire, like I told you at the beginning. He counted on that fire and he hoped that it would burn up the evidence. And we know that it was his intention and his hope that the evidence would be destroyed from 2 statements that have been put in evidence before you at this trial. 2 different statements. Think back to Mandy Cupper. Mandy Cupper is the daycare provider. 2 days after Vashti's death, the defendant makes a special point to go in and tell Mandy Cupper everything that happened. And one of the things that he says to her is, well, I heard that the pool table from the 3rd floor is all the way in the basement. Because that's what he thinks happened. That's what he's hoping happened, that all the evidence burned, that the whole house burned. He doesn't know that it didn't. Pool table didn't end up in the basement. Agent Monty told you that they found what they believed to be the remains of a pool table on the 3rd floor. 2 days after Vashti's dead, the defendant thinks the house is burned. He thinks the evidence is covered up. The other statement comes from the recorded interview made to Agent Folletti. And this is CD2 at 1 hour, 27 minutes, and 50 seconds. He tells Agent Folletti, "I don't know if the house is in any shape for you to know where anything was at inside." 12 days after death, he still thinks he's destroyed the crime scene with the fire.
45 minutes left.
Thank you. So how does that tie into the journal? Well, if his plan and his intent is to destroy the crime scene, then he's still got to plant some evidence of suicide, if that's going to be his story. He's also got to explain the fire. And we have his forged note to try to explain the fire. Remember the line in there about, "I'm taking care of the house for you"? This is why he's got to forge the note. One of the reasons he has to forge the note. So he gets Vashti's journal and he traces different words and phrases with the help of an overhead projector. And then we have what I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, is an obvious forgery. These are in evidence. You'll be able to have these back in the jury room. It states 195, question note, and the known of Vashti Seacat. Now, you probably didn't need an expert to come in here and tell you that these are different. It is obvious. But we brought you an expert with years of training and experience, who's tested twice a year for proficiency. He's board certified, and he says this is textbook forgery. Shows you all the different categories. The categories of tremors, retracing, the different writing styles that Vashti had that were not the same in these two notes. Look at these when you go back to the jury room. This is an obvious forgery, just another piece of physical evidence against the defendant. The defendant also made several statements. And when you consider his statements, what you should do is ask yourselves what he knew at the time that he made each statement, because that's crucial. It dictates what he says. He chooses what he's going to tell by the timing of his statement and what he knows and what he thinks law enforcement knows. So his first statement, we've got the 911 call. And when he calls, he's lit all three fires. He thinks the house is going to burn, and he's already planting seeds about the suicide. "I think she's dead. I think she shot herself." Sowers arrives. He talks to Sowers. Still thinks that the whole house will burn. He doesn't know that the fire in the master bedroom hasn't taken off yet. And he tells Sowers she's dead. She shot herself. Her head is gone. Her head is gone. How does that statement make sense? Her head's not gone. That statement makes no sense unless you think the evidence at the scene is going to burn and nobody can tell anyway. He talks to Holloway. This is within a couple hours of Vashti's death, and he knows at this time that the entire south wall of the home is on fire because he stood there with Sowers and watched that shoot up. He still thinks the house is going to burn up all the evidence, and at this point he's got to get statements in there about trying to get her out. He's got to explain his actions. He has to try and paint the picture of somebody rescuing his wife who's committed suicide. So he's planting seeds. This is the first time we hear about the castle episode. Supposedly they're watching TV together, and she sees this episode, and there's a gun, the dirty hairy gun in the episode, and she asks if that would be a good gun to commit suicide with. He plants that seed with Holloway within a couple of hours of her death. He also makes that statement to Agent Folletti 12 days later, actually 12 days later, in the recorded interview. You know who he never made that statement to? Who he never talked to about the castle episode? The counselor, Connie Suderman. He told Agent Folletti that the focus of the counseling was Vashti's depression. Well, if the focus is Vashti's depression, why is he not telling the counselor about this gun that she asked whether or not it would be good to kill herself with? Now, the interview with Agent Folletti is all manipulation, it's all gamesmanship, and he's telling them things that he thinks they already know, like the threats with the kids. Why did he tell them that? Because he knows they're going to interview Connie Suderman. Why does he bring up the journal? He brings up the journal, he says he had access to it, he says he took it and made copies. Why does he do that? Because he's law enforcement, he knows the journal's been collected, he knows it's going to be fingerprinted, as it was, and he has to put himself in connection with that journal in case they find fingerprints. And if you go back and watch that video, notice the demeanor and the body language and ask yourselves if that appears to be a man who's distraught 12 days after his wife's death. Watch the body language and the demeanor on that video. He also makes a statement, as you know, to Mandy Cupper. And she thinks this is odd because it's just 2 days after Vashti's death, and what he's telling her is that she was in a deep depression. And Mandy Cupper says that doesn't match anything that she saw that day, that week, or ever out of Vashti Seacat. And she tells you that he volunteers all the details of what happens that night, but he won't say Vashti's name. He only says her or her body. He's only emotional when he talks about the boys, brings up the pool table, says how he thinks it's still in the basement. He's out manipulating the message. He's controlling the message. Connie Suderman, the morning after, he tries to call her right away, doesn't get her till 9:30. Now, his statements, I killed her, it's my fault. Why is he making those to Connie Suderman? He's making those statements for the same reason that he brought out the threats in front of you when he testified. You're supposed to feel sorry for the guy who's shouldering the blame for his wife's suicide, and that's what he's setting up with Connie Suderman. He's trying to gain sympathy. He knows that Connie knows about the threats to the kids already, so he brings that out to her again, and he's trying to control the message. He's trying to manipulate Connie Suderman. And he takes notes. He has notes for how to manipulate and control his message. Remember this yellow piece of paper? Read it. And then Agent Folletti told you that on May 13th, 13 days later, when he was arrested, he still had this on his person. He's got his notes with him on how to control the message. He has those notes with him the entire time, just like the notes that he had when he took the witness stand. He always has a script. He always has an answer. He has an answer for everything. On direct examination, you will remember that he was able to provide every detail that his attorney asked for. He even volunteered more. In response to one question, he said, well, it's actually easier if we go back and explain that from the beginning, so that he could start from where he wanted to talk to. Another example of control and manipulation by Brett Seacat. And on direct, when his attorneys need answers, they get the answers. On cross, when I want a detail, he wants a transcript. That's what he asked for. More manipulation and control. He did make a point to correct certain things when he was on the witness stand, some of the inconsistencies that are obvious, and he has to explain, like the threats, the affairs, the private photograph. Those things were asked about, threats were asked about in the recorded interview with Agent Folletti. Go to CD2 at 1 hour and 18 minutes. You will see Agent Folletti ask him, any threats or anything at all? The answer, no, nothing. That's different than what he told you here in court. There are 4 crimes the defendant is charged with, starting with first-degree murder, which requires proof of premeditation. And you've got proof of that. The day before, he's at KLATC, he's planning, he's practicing forgery, he's destroying hard drives and cell phones, he's forging the note. You've also got the PowerPoint. It's on the dining room table in his house. Remember this? This is a PowerPoint that law enforcement collected It talks about facts to be determined in fire death investigations. It's got that out on the dining room table. He retrieves the gas. That's premeditation. He leaves the boys in the house to see the fire because they may get interviewed. That's premeditation. He shoots her while she's asleep. All of his actions after the fact to cover up the crime, the fire, the planning the call, planning the journal, that's premeditation. And premeditation is not disputed by the defense. They've narrowed the issue to murder or suicide. They're not disputing whether or not this was a premeditated act. The elements of aggravated arson start with the intentional damage of a dwelling by fire. We know we have a fire here. That the defendant did so without the consent of Vashti Seacat. Julie Hostetler testified that Vashti didn't and wouldn't have consented to the defendant burning the house down. And we know that from all the evidence. He killed her. She certainly didn't consent to the fire. We know the 2 children were in the house at the time. We know that that endangered them. We also know that through stipulation, which are in your jury instructions, that Vashti Seacat had an interest in the home. And the date that this occurred is not in dispute. We've got 2 counts of aggravated child endangerment, 1 for each boy. Now, the evidence of aggravated child endangerment comes from the defendant's own testimony. He tells you that the boys are in the home at the time of the fire. You might be asking yourselves why he left the boys in the home, why he endangered their lives, and we've already talked about that. He had to leave them there in case they got interviewed. And you'll recall that Sergeant Sowers told you that both boys were interviewed. But even more important than that, the fact that the children were in the home at the time that this happened tells you that Vashti Seacat didn't commit this act. She did not kill herself. She was a mother who had a close relationship with her sons. She was a mother those children were her whole world. That was the testimony. She took pains to make sure that they ate right. She cooked organic. She picked them up, dropped them off from daycare every day. She had issues with Brett's parenting style. She would not have risked the lives of her 2 young sons by starting that fire. She would not have committed suicide and left those 2 sons with a man she was divorcing and a man whose parenting style she didn't agree with. She would not have risked him, the defendant, not getting upstairs in time to save those boys. She wouldn't have risked that he might not even answer the phone. Vashti Seacat did not commit these acts. The children were still in the home when the fire was set. And that brings us back to the only reason that anyone would set that house on fire, to cover up a crime scene. And that's the defendant's actions. That's what he was doing. He was the only one with a reason to set the fire. You'll have verdict forms back in the jury room for each count. You'll have all of the evidence to go through, all the physical evidence, the photos. There's several enlargements. They will be back there with diagrams, charts for you to consider. And remember this jury instruction about common sense. You have a right to use common knowledge and experience. That's the one thing we didn't ask you to leave at the door. Remember that blank slate that we were talking about during jury selection? That slate's full. It's full of evidence that proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Brett Seacat committed these murders. He's had statements, he's had testimony, he has had an answer for everything. And now it's time to give the defendant your answer. Find him guilty as charged.
You used 59 minutes. You have 31 minutes left, Ms. Hanley. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and take a brief recess because the next portion of closing argument is going to be an hour and a half long. I want you to make a quick restroom stop and then go right back into the jury room. I want to try to be back in here in 10 minutes. Again, remember the recess instruction. You haven't got the case submitted to you yet. Don't confer or allow anyone to confer with you. Don't express any opinions and don't form any fixed opinions. We'll see you in a few minutes. We're in recess.